Welcome to this very special session with Walter Mignolo. It is always a pleasure to see so many faces from different places of the world in this group. And we meet every second week in a different constellation to discuss selected texts with international scholars. And today we have the enormous honor and pleasure of introducing Walter Mignolo to you, one of the main thinkers of decoloniality. Walter Mignolo is the William H. Wanamaker Distinguished Professor of Roman Studies and Professor of Literature and Director of the Center of Global Studies and the Humanities at Duke University. His work has been translated into German, Italian, French, Swedish, Romanian, Spanish, Portuguese, Mandarin, and Korean. Walter Mignolo was awarded several honorary positions, among others by the CISA, Center for Indian Studies in South Africa at Wits University at Johannesburg, and by the Universidad de Buenos Aires, Argentina. His first groundbreaking publication for the topic of our interest was The Darker Side of the Renaissance, Literacy, Territoriality, and Colonization from 1995. That was awarded the Catherine Singer Kovacs Prize by the MLA. And other titles include Delinking, The Rhetoric of Modernity, The Logic of Coloniality, and the Grammar of Decoloniality, published in 2007. Local Histories, Global Designs, Coloniality, Subaltern Knowledges, and Border Thinking from 2000. And The Idea of Latin America from 2006, that was awarded the Fanon Prize by the Caribbean Philosophical Association. Next year, we will be able to read his forthcoming publication, The Politics of Decolonial Investigations. And the book we have prepared for today is on decoloniality, concepts, analysis, praxis, co-authored with Catarina Walsh from 2018. However, Professor Mignolo was so generous to also share some other very recent articles with us, among others, a dialogue with Marina Tlostanova, and his still unpublished article, Memorias y Reflexiones en torno a la decolonialidad del poder. So, querido Walter, we are all very excited to discuss these texts with you today. Thank you so much for being here. And please join me in welcoming Walter Mignolo.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Catarina, and all the people who are attending. So I see that you have a list of events in the following weeks, and I am curious because there are some that I would like to listen to. I don't know if you have Rita Segato, my great friend Rita Segato. We disagree in a lot of things, but we love each other, so we are always kind of chatting. And I saw that you sent me a piece by Graciela Montaldo, another old friend, on Rita Segato. So that just that to say that I feel very comfortable. I'm kind of feel in the family.
Thank you so much. Yes, actually, Rita Segato agreed to join in one of the sessions next year, but we haven't decided on a specific date yet. But once I know, I will text you again. So maybe you could join the discussion. That would be amazing.
No, that's I don't know if she will admit me to discuss, but I would like to listen, right? Uh, well, okay. So apparently, the central piece is the on decoloniality. But yeah, I think I sent you the short text with Marina, the latest one, right?
Yes,
That was published in Moscow.
in the East
Yeah.
revista. Yes.
Yeah, that was very interesting because it's a group in Moscow that's a kind of looking into, I think it's uh, philosophy from the East or something like that.
Yes. FanDuel Sportsbook makes it incredibly easy to get your winnings fast.
Oh.
But to make it even easier,
I'm sorry, can everybody who's not speaking please turn off their microphones? And then, of course, if you want to join in the discussion, you're always welcome to say something and turn them on. Or if you want to ask a question, you can always write in the chat, and then I will tell you to speak. And of course, the other thing I want to say is you can always speak in Spanish or in English. Ustedes pueden hablar o en español o en inglés y luego lo podemos traducir para el grupo, ¿vale? Vale, I'm so sorry.
No,
Continue, please.
that's okay. I mean, uh, I think that the beauty of this kind of workshop is like it's a kind of informal conversation, a kind of getting together in a room to chat about specific things. So that's very informal and very relaxed. And I like that. I like that very much. Um, yeah. So the reason I sent you that is because everybody talk about the global south, but I said, well, what about the global east? We were talking with Medina about that. So one of the chapter on the forthcoming book is titled "The South of the North and the West of the East," meaning that Europe, Italy, Greece, Portugal, and the south of the north, and Texas, Georgia, North Carolina are the south of the north. But the Middle East is the west of Asia, is the west of the East. So, and all that is entangled. That is the reason I sent you that to kind of start thinking about how the colonial Mexico power kind of organized through global linear thinking the planetary order, because there is nothing in reality that is north, south, east, and west. Doesn't exist beyond the map, and 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 it's very difficult to still, for me, I don't know for the younger generation, but for me still it's a kind of, I had to make an effort to think in that way, that time is not something that exists, that time is a human way to measure in repetition and transformation, that reality is something that when somebody say, hey, come on, be real, what that person is telling you, think like me, think that reality is like I think is reality, or be objective, come on, be objective, I am objective, you are kind of being out of track. So that is that I start with that because that is one fundamental, I will say, epistemic or philosophical principle of decolonial thinking. You can find that in Europe too, right? You can find that in certain Heidegger, you can find that in certain Derrida. So that is not the novelty. The novelty is that when Heidegger or Derrida kind of make this kind of a statement, they are within Western cosmology. And the decolonial is kind of getting in the exteriority of Western cosmology. Not outside, because there is no outside, but the exteriority is the outside invented in the process to build the inside. And exteriority is necessary because if something is totally outside, you cannot control it. But in order to control it, say, well, this is the other, but the other is what I made, I invented the other in order to kind of, I classify the other and I control the other, I control exteriority. So the question is, when people talk about the global south and the global east, what they are saying, and this is important, beyond what I just said, it's very important because they are asserting a locality that was destituted by coloniality in the name of modernity, in the name of progress, modernity, civilization, development. So decolonial thinking is that kind of start from this kind of a statement. Number one, that modernity is not the ontological unfolding of universal history, a la Hegel, for example. Since you are in Germany, you know that very well, probably from high school. Uh, is not the unfolding, ontological unfolding of universal history, because universal history is a local narrative, right? Uh, but modernity is just that, a bunch of narrative told by people who located themselves in the present of time at the center of a space. And that again is Hegel. But Hegel is not just getting this out of the hat like a magician. Without Christianity, without Christian theology, Hegel is not possible. Because what Hegel did was implies two things: displace Rome as a center to Germany as a center, and place the present of time in Germany and in Europe. So this I mention Hegel because it's one of the most master narrative of how modernity invented itself. But already the foundation was in the Renaissance. And the foundation of the Renaissance is when Europe, the second moment of the Renaissance, because the standard date of the Renaissance is more or less for between 1300 to 1600. So before of 1350, before 1500, there are already 150 years in which what we call today Europe began to kind of build itself, not as Europe, but as Western Christianity. Europe is not yet. But Western Christianity was necessary Western Christians were necessary to assert themselves because they lost the crusade, and when they lost the crusade, they lost Jerusalem, and so they needed a different center. And then, in a complicated history between Constantinople and Rome, so Rome comes the center of Western Christians, right? And Constantinople remained the kind of the Eastern Christian. So that is kind of constitute the kind of the formation of Western Christianity and the idea of Europe and the idea of modernity as interiority that invent the exteriority. And the first exteriority that helps to consolidate the idea of Europe and Western Christian of Europe is the Americas. Right? That is the first exteriority. And in that first exteriority, the kind of the colonial difference began to be created because there was no such a thing as colonial. We cannot find anything like colonial difference before 1500. And so the colonial difference is precisely one way to create the exteriority. And in what that exteriority was constructed mainly ontological and epistemological, which are two categories, kind of Western way of thinking. So ontological, it was decided by the people who told the narrative of Christianity from the perspective of men, humanity, the human. That Indians and Africans were ontologically inferior beings, and because they were ontologically inferior beings, they were epistemologically deficient. And that you had a foundation of racism. as we have it today. So racism is not a question of blood, it's not a question of color of skin. Those are kind of surface markers. It's not a question of your nationality, it's not a question of your religion, your language. It's a classification. And all those are kind of exterior markers to legitimize a classification in relation to a model of man human, the right languages, the right narrative, the right concept of history, etc., etc. And once this was established in the Atlantic, with the invention of America, it began to be spread all over the rest of the planet. What happened in Asia, what happened in Africa cannot be understood without this kind of foundation, which Quijano kind of illuminated with the concept of coloniality and coloniality of power, and the colonial matrix of power. So that is our kind of. So what I did in the second part of on decoloniality was trying to kind of update 20 years of work of a group of people who started and based on Quijano. Dussel is very important there, but really the foundation is Quijano. All the kind of the concept that I analyze there. So you see that I like I don't want to talk too much, but I like the article by the group Modernity, Coloniality that you distribute, that is a kind of response to Hernandez. It's very clear, and they kind of spot 2 or 3 crucial points, very well taken, very well explained also, very clearly. And one that is useful in this introduction I am making is when they say, well, it's not the perspective of coloniality, it's the perspective of decoloniality that distinguishes us. Huh? So to help you to kind of understand a way of thinking, but also a way of sensing. Because coloniality is not you cannot understand coloniality rationally, but you could. But you just understand half of it. I always tell my students in the past 20 years, to understand coloniality, and now I kind of tell you the same thing, because you see, before saying that, let me say something else. Coloniality is a concept that was invented in the third world, not in Europe, not in the United States, where all the concepts are invented. And why it was invented in the third world and not in Europe? Because in Europe you cannot sense coloniality. You cannot see coloniality. In the United States, you can see coloniality if you are a Chicano or a gay or a lesbian or an African. But the main scholarship, the mainstream, they cannot see. They cannot see, they cannot sense coloniality. And in Europe, the people who really sense coloniality are immigrants, are refugees, and this is not an accusation of people who were born and are kind of educated. That is the way it is. So when I say, think about where coloniality touched you, where do you sense it? Because coloniality touches us in a very different way. Depending on where we are, what kind of social class, gender, sexual preference, religion, languages, etc., local history, because we are not just individual. We belong to a local history that is the local history of a country, of a group, of a religion, etc. So think about where coloniality is touching you. Where do you feel it? How you relate some of your discomfort to coloniality. that is when I discovered coloniality, the kind of illuminate, made me understand a lot of things that were happening to me and I didn't understand. I said, ah. So I became a different person. I started kind of acting differently. I became, because before, I mean, I was more or less secure of myself, but going to Europe, I was always kind of inferior, in inferior condition. And coming to United States too. I mean, I was a kind of Sudaca in Europe. I was a Latin American in United States, etc., etc. So I sense coloniality, and then when I sense coloniality, I began to kind of understand it historically, conceptually. So the darker side of the Renaissance, published in '95, is a biographical book. I was not trained in Renaissance. I was not trained in history. I was not trained in cartography. I was trained in semiotics. So in question of language, I could deal with that. So the darker side of the Renaissance is a book out of anger, not out of kind of scholarship. Well, you have to use a scholarship. That is the trick. You have to use a scholarship in order to be listened to. Because if you just write a pamphlet on the Renaissance, nobody will pay attention to. But I knew what, at that point, I already knew how to play the game. I knew that I had to play the game in English. A lot of people criticized me because I didn't write the book in Spanish. But reading the book in Spanish, this kind of discussion were not yet in Spain. Spain didn't want to hear about this kind of thing, right? So I knew what I was doing. I was doing out of anger, and it's a political statement in the kind of form of a scholarship. So I use a scholarship to make a political statement rather than let scholarship use me to advance whatever, semiotics or Renaissance studies or whatever. So this is kind of the colonial thinking, kind of shifting the geography of sensing and reasoning. So when somebody says, what is the colonial thinking? You cannot define the colonial thinking. You have to see it in act. And that is the way I do it. It doesn't mean that you have to do it like that, but you have to find your own way to do it if that is what you want to do. So going back, where do you sense coloniality will touch you? And then, where do you see around you? What do you see in the street? What do you see in the news? What do you see in television? What do you see in the advertising? What you see in the restaurant, what kind of food, what is kind of advertising of the food. So then you can go to kind of the debate of, the conflict between China and the United States and the Middle East, etc., etc. So you can start building and understand the global order and understand how the global order affects you. So there is a kind of correlation between this kind of understanding of the global order through the colonial matrix of power and your subjectivity. How that is kind of... So the question of identity, that people want to know who I am. If you ask me who I am, who are you, I don't know who I am, and I really don't care. I don't care about my identity. Well, I said, I have a U.S. passport, and I have a kind of expired Argentinian passport, but I go to Argentina with a kind of cédula de identidad. So I son of immigrant, Italian. So I know all those things about my kind of legal status and my kind of family tradition, etc. But asking who I am, I really don't care, because what really cares is how people see me. Not who I am, but how I am seen. And that is what Fanon gave us a fantastic, crucial concept, sociogenesis. So Fanon said Darwin was interested in the kind of evolution of the species, so he needed the concept of phylogenesis. Freud was interested in the person, so he needed the concept of ontogenesis. And Fanon said, neither of them are useful for me. And that is, you see the exteriority. You start thinking from exteriority. No, those are not, that is irrelevant for me. That doesn't tell me anything about what I feel and what I want to explain and what to kind of articulate. So he invented the concept of sociogenesis. And sociogenesis is how I am seen. There is a very well-known anecdote that he tells, and I explain this, when he said that he was walking on the street of Lyon in France, and there is a mother walking with, I don't know, a daughter or a son, 7, 8, 10 years old, and the daughter of the son said, "Regarde, maman, en noir." So he said that for him was a shock, because he knew that he had black skin, but being a noir or being a black or being a negro, as was translated into English, being a negro is much more than having dark skin. Being a negro is a whole imaginary of the Western culture. Since the biblical narrative, but then slavery and all this kind of thing. So sociogenesis is a concept that emerged also, couldn't emerge from a white person, and couldn't emerge in Europe or Anglo-America. It had to emerge from somebody who comes from the Caribbean and is kind of black, Negro, as a kind of category of exteriority. So, summarizing, and I stop here, if you want to understand coloniality, just think about, as Bob Marley said, and in the first chapter that I quote, none other than us can liberate ourselves, which is a sentence of Marcus Garvey, but Bob Marley kind of popularized it. So think about, and if you are not touched by coloniality, when a lot of people are touched, you have to be aware, why I'm not touched. So you are not responsible of not being touched, because you didn't select to be born and educated where you were born and educated. But you have the ethical responsibility to say, now we are racist. I mean, racist seems that there's a problem of black and Indians and Arabs and Chinese and Russian. But we are all implicated in racism and in coloniality. Racism is kind of systemic. Nobody's outside of racism and say, oh, look, racists, they are racist. No. We are in the racial kind of imaginary, let's put it that way. So think about this kind of relationship between you and between what you see over there. And racism is not a question of just a classification of people. It's a classification of region of the planet and gender. When in the Cold War we were talking about First World, Second World, and Third World, that is a racist classification. Who classified? Not the Third World. We said, hey, I belong to the Third World, or the Second World. No, the one who classified were the people from the First World. And look at the trick. This was a magic trick. And if you think decolonially, you began to see these kind of things that trick under the narrative of modernity. Because the Third World is a modern narrative. So the Third World has to become the first, and the Second World has to be eliminated because they are communist. So it's a classification that justifies the advance of modernity and the implementation of coloniality. So the trick is this, that the first world occupied two positions. The first world is one of the three, but the first world is the only one who classifies. And then you see the relevance of the enunciation and the enuncé. The enunciation is where things are being decided. The only way to get to the enunciation is through the enuncé, or the set, the content, but we cannot remain there. And that is the problem of modernity. One of the problems. The problem for us of modernity, for them was very good because they managed to prevent people to look at the enunciation of modernity. They kind of diplomatically force everybody to look at the content, not to the enunciation. So, this is kind of a different version of what I'm trying to do in the second part. There are much more to say, but let's open up for a conversation.
Thank you so much. This is very fascinating, and I'm so glad you have already touched several different points on your main theses of the things you said in the different texts. So I think everybody will be able to relate. And actually, because you asked us, where do we notice coloniality? I think one thing that is usually very much looked down on is the separation between nature and humanity, or like the invention of the concept of human beings separated from nature and from the cosmos.
Oh,
So I
that's it.
that is something that struck me especially today, because I was struggling with technology, but and then I was reminded of that. But yes, and I'm sure everybody has a lot of questions, I think, and a lot of answers to this from their unique perspectives and from their own objectivities. But the first thing that I would have asked you is, what are the questions that we should be asking to get as close as possible to the peripheries of the matrix, right? Because you said there is no safe space within the matrix. We're too deep inside this way of thinking, and it's almost impossible to imagine a thinking outside of that. We really have to question the coordinates we live by. And how do we do that? How do we decolonize our minds?
Okay, but don't forget the question of nature. That I forgot to say something, but it's very important, so we should come back to it. Right. Good question. Thank you. Very important question. The borderland. For me, that is the only place that is kind of available. Uh, and the borderland is in Europe too. The borderland is all over because coloniality is all over. Because coloniality kind of, let me see, let me put it this way. Modernity is a narrative that justifies all kind of destitution in order to constitute itself as modernity or postmodernity or Eurocentrism or Western civilization will be, yeah? So those narrative needs to destitute, to devalue, to negate in order to constitute and maintain itself. But at the moment you have the constitution destitution are simultaneous movement. There's no one after the other. You constitute something by destituting, right? you destitute the Muslim to reaffirm and constitute Christianity and Western secularism. It's simultaneous. And what appeared there? The border. So what a Muslim or an Indian or an African, in what situation are they put? The Muslim or the Indian or the African, I'm simplifying here, they have their own memories, languages, tradition, way of praxis of living that was disrupted. Now, in order to kind of restitute, and so decoloniality is a kind of restitution, but also reconstitution. You have to reconstitute your way of knowing, your way of being, but you cannot reconstitute it anymore as it was in the past, because modernity already interfered. So you are in the border. You are in the borderlands. I give you two examples. I have friends, intellectuals and activists, Aymaras. So they are kind of working in two fronts. One of them was very active in kind of mobilizing the Aymara population in the last election of Bolivia. So they are kind of, but at the same time, parallel to that, they are reconstituting Aymara knowledge, an Aymara way of being, an Aymara praxis of living. That is a communal task that separated from the rest of Bolivia, the nation. But at the same time, they cannot just live isolated. They have to kind of make themselves strong in order to make their position heard with the state. So they are in the border. And they are in the border, and this is the privilege, not the privilege, the potential of border dwelling and border thinking and border doing at this time. Why? Because people who dwell in the border knows their own reason and practice of living and the reason of the people who live in the territory invading, creating the exteriority. You see what I mean? While the people who live in the territory only know the reason of the territory. And that is what is kind of the demise of Western civilization. The demise of Western civilization, by that I don't mean that Western civilization had to disappear, no. Western civilization, I have to say something about myself, but there's many things to say here. Western civilization has the right to exist. Western civilization is the youngest of all civilizations since, let's say, the Homo sapiens, 300,000 years ago, something like that. But it's the first civilization that were able to disrupt all other civilizations. So all other civilizations now, and people in that civilization, because civilization is an entity, it's a people. You don't have dialogue of civilization. You have dialogue between people who belong to different civilizations. So, but simplifying, those people are in a kind of a strong position because of that. Let me give you another example. I taught a seminar, co-taught a seminar with a colleague from Taiwan who is a duke in Kunshan in China, near Shanghai, 2 years ago. And we have 22 kids, but they were kids, but 18, 20, undergraduate. 18 from mainland China, one from Taiwan and one from Hong Kong. Oh, in English, of course. And one of the conversation was precisely that. That they were kind of feeling that they have to learn English because English is a kind of superior language. You have some kind of clout or something like that. And we began to tell them, and I think we convinced them. I mean, with my friend from Taiwan, said, well, listen, Mandarin, the number of speakers in Mandarin is 3 or 4 times larger than the speaker of English and Spanish, which are the second or third language, depending one of the second or third languages. And imagine that you have the power of having Mandarin and Confucius and Mencius and Laosis and you name it, and then you have English. But people speak English, don't speak Japanese. There are a few, right? So when you began to exploit that, I mean, if China cannot be stopped, because you cannot stop capitalism with a population of 1.5 billion people. So capitalism is kind of killing him. I mean, Western capitalism, liberal capitalism, neoliberal capitalism is killing itself because it kind of was appropriated by a population who comes from a different kind of memories, history, or way of living, and don't expect the Chinese will be kind of liberal democracy. Why? And don't believe that the liberal democracy is the paradise. Liberal democracy is not the paradise. It's a good idea, as Gandhi said about Western civilization. But so you see the question. You see the power of the border. But let me see two more things. But the power is also the power of border is inside Europe now, and it's inside United States, because the rest of the world is in United States and is in Europe. But I would say more. For example, in United States, you know, there has been for years a kind of debate between white feminism and women of color. And women of color are all coming from someplace else. Even if they are kind of black that were born in United States, but I mean, they don't belong to the white British tradition, and Native American, Muslim, etc. But even white women are in the border. Are in the border between white masculinity and white femininity. Of course, everything is complex, and as a women of color kind of made very clear, white women still believe that they have the kind of the universal way of being women. So there are different kind of scales in the border, but border, for me, borderland, border dwelling, border thinking is the place to be. And border dwelling, border thinking is very important to get out of Western dichotomous way of thinking. Derrida already kind of did some work there, but for us is neither A nor B, but just the opposite. One example, when George Bush was kind of justifying the invasion of Iraq, he pronounced a famous discourse, famous, I mean, stay in the memory of the people. You are with me or you are with my enemy. So the decolonial thinker said, sorry, Georgie, we are neither with you nor with your enemy. We are into different kind of. So the borderland is a way to escape that trap. The trap of this is the way of thinking, that is reality, etc. So that is a way to start addressing this. But once you realize that, to get there, I think you have to realize, you have to feel first how coloniality touched you, and then kind of find out in what kind of borderland you are inhabiting, in what borderland you are dwelling. And then you began to see you begin to feel, sense, understand when you relate to people that dwell in the territory. And that is another interesting thing, because how you act. When you are in, I mean, the enslaved people know the reason of the slave and the reason of the master. The master only know the reason of the master. So the slave person is in the border. But at the same time, he or she knows that the master is the master. So how do we act with him or her? If you are in the territory, you antagonize. You take the opposite position, and you are dead because you play their logic. So you have to play poker. That is the kind of the best metaphor I can find it. I mean, playing poker is you enter in dialogue, and then at some point you have to know when to fold it. When you went too far. So that is a kind of it's a strategy of survival. It's not necessary yet the revolution, because the revolution is another thing. The revolution that today is has to be thought differently, and that is why in the first chapter of my section I make the difference between decolonization during the Cold War and decoloniality after the Cold War. There are two different things. I mean, today, after the end of the Cold War, the kind of revolution that Lumumba and Cabral and Biko and even Fanon, I mean, that he was not Algerian, but he was there in the middle of the thick. That kind of revolution, the Cuban Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, all those are revolutions within the Cold War. After the end of the Cold War revolution, that kind of revolution is unthinkable. So that the question is, so what is the coloniality good for now? Well, I stop there to just let another intervention.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much. I wish we could talk about everything that you touch upon, because like I at least have a million questions, and 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 I'm so grateful for you that you mentioned how important it is for us to think in pluriversal ways, and to that you touched on the border and thinking the border, like Gloria Anzaldúa also said, and the danger of a single story that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie mentions in her TED talk. I think there's so many things we could talk about. Not only bilinguality, but also like being able to speak several different languages with different mindsets, etc. I think there's a lot, but I've already gotten two questions from a
Okay.
group in the chat, and I think there will definitely be more. So I think why don't we assemble three different questions, and then you can
Yeah, take three, two, three. Yeah.
yeah.
If there are three, take three.
Okay, Antonio and Maria Eugenia.
Do you want me to talk? Yeah.
Sure, why not?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Catarina, for the seminar. Thank you, Walter, for being part of the seminar too. I have my question actually is really is catching what you were saying, the last thing you were saying, Walter. It is, how would you define a decolonial praxis that might enable, that might change the world or create better societies? What I mean by that is that, like critical theory, it seems to me, but it's much more for ignorance on my part, that where we are stick a lot into a epistemic approach, like the theory, right? It's just important. And as you said just now, you explained now, maybe there's a turn after the Cold War, after the Soviet Union, the critical theories decide to stick into theory because of the bad practice. But right now, maybe we need to think about decolonial praxis, because, as you point out in the book, the Anthropocene, the climate crisis, the alt-right, we need the epistemic approach for sure, but we also need a praxis to create another world, to at least to do something. So it was really what you were saying at the end. I mean, what decolonial theory is good for, or I mean, it was just this. It was just this. Thank you. Gracias.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important question.
Okay, do we have two more questions? Ana de Carolis, would you like me to read your question, or do you want to speak up?
Hello, I can read it. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mignolo. My question is about desoccidentalización, the concept that you propose in Memorias y Reflexiones en torno a la decolonialidad del poder. And I was wondering if you could expand on that concept. And you mentioned, if I understood correctly, Bolivia, Argentina, with the Kirchners, I imagine Venezuela, Brazil, Ecuador, Uruguay with Mujica as governments aligned with desoccidentalización. And I was wondering if you would say, or if we could say that EVOS Bolivia was also a decolonial project, or is decolonialidad contradictory with the idea of a nation state?
Thank you so much. And the third question is from Maria Eugenia. She's asking if you could touch on the intraculturalidad based on the indigenous from South America, and if there are 5 steps of disciplines in the universities: conocimiento, pasión, hacer, política y causal, vida y conocimiento, are in some way common elements of the reconstitution and restitution of the African Black indigenous.
Can you read the second part of the question slowly?
Yeah. If the 5 steps of disciplines in the indigenous universities of South America are related to the reconstitution and restitution of the African Black indigenous.
The indigenous universities, the Amautaiwasi, is referring she to Amautaiwasi or what?
I think so. Yes, she's not. Okay. There's actually another question that we can maybe quickly also ask from Josh Weeks, and then you have all the space again. Josh, would you like to?
Yeah, thank you, Walter. That was really, really fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I'm asking a question related to my own work, because I'm writing on Borges and Bolaño. And my question is, can we find decolonial potential in the work of writers who are categorized as modernist writers? And I'm thinking of the likes of Borges, because it seems to me that although he's part of maybe the modernist tradition, perhaps as a Latin American writer, he did inhabit the borderland to a certain extent. And I wonder whether there is potential to read his work in a decolonial way.
Wow. Literature, yeah, that's important. I mean, the kind of literature always kind of get out of this kind of conversation. Well, four really very important points have been, let's start with Antonio then. We cannot change the world if people who inhabit the world do not change. That is a very important distinction between the Marxist concept of praxis and the decolonial concept of praxis. The world is not something that exists over there. The world is us. And so that the decolonial start from ourselves. We have to become different decolonial subjects. And that is a discussion going on, and in that sense, the praxis, the decolonial praxis, is to rebuild, reconstitute the communal. So the communal, the indigenous people have to reconstitute the communal in a different way because they had it. We didn't. I mean, we who are not indigenous, we didn't have it. What we have is a social. And the social and the communal are two different ball games. The social is a Western concept that goes together with sociology, the discipline of sociology. And the social is a structure of human being. It's kind of unequal, and we know all this kind of, but only for the human being. The communal is our relationship with life. So what we learn from indigenous people is that the communal, the family, is not just papa, nene, mama, but is the extended family of the IU or the oikos in ancient Greece, but it's also the llamas and the vicuñas and the river and the mountain and the trees. So that is the communal. So that the communal began to kind of re-articulate the relationship with what we call nature. Nature, we have to cross it because nature is a noun that reduces the splendid diversity of life into an entity that can be exploited. That's why we have natural resources. So nature is a resource. And now human resources, we are resource. So those are kind of things that that important in the kind of decolonial praxis. And how you change that? You cannot change that by public policy. By public policy, you cannot, because public policy is enforcing something positive or negative. And people don't like to be enforced. But, I mean, we have to follow some rules, right? In order to kind of... but the question is how you build the communal and begin to think not just in me, I, but in we, nosotros. So in Latin America now is a lot of people who are kind of talking about coming back to the nosotros. The nosotros is like Ubuntu in Africa. I am in relation to you. I am in relation to other person. I cannot. And that concept of the individual is a Western concept. In no other society you have this kind of detached entity that then led to meritocracy and kind of... And look, I mean, Trump is a very interesting case for many ways. No? Trump is the epitome, kind of the extreme level of this concept of the ego of the individual. To the point, what happened after the election? Since the election, the only thing he cared is to demonstrate there was fraud. He totally forgot about people dying, people getting infected, the kind of economy in crisis, etc., etc. So the reestablishing el nosotros is a very important decolonial praxis. And this is something that we can do. Now, the second thing I would say, to think of the colonial praxis, is to be aware of our limits. Where and what we, the people who are here in this room, can do. When we have billions of trillions, the Forbes magazine the other day published a list of the 150 billionaires in the world. Most of the West, some already in China, some in Mexico, etc. Those people are ruling the world in the kind of the finances. But then the finances, the state, the nation state, now somebody asked for the nation state. The nation state is no longer the state who care for the nation. The state don't care for the nation. There are exceptions. But in general, in Argentina now we have a state that cares for the nation. But the previous government didn't. So Evo Morales, with all the problems, more or less care for the nation. But when the military coup, it just entered a kind of band of delinquent, I would say, that didn't care for the people. They just care for the kind of the well-being, etc., etc. So I think that the praxis is the reconstituting the communal, and the communal is a task of the political society. And the political society is a kind of something that emerged out of the civil society in the kind of the liberal way of state market society. But the political society is a society that is already walking, reconstituting themselves. I mean, you see it. You see it. I mean, you see what you see, for example, you see the Zapatistas, you see the Kurds, they're kind of organizing themselves in spite of Syria and Turkey. They're kind of reorganizing themselves as a kind of communal way of living. The Zapatistas have been doing it. The peasant way, La Via Campesina, is doing that in a different way. So while we cannot depend from Monsanto, we have to do something with the seed. So that is the way of transforming, changing the world, because we change the thing we do. And there is no way at this point to do it through the state. The person, Anna I think, asked us, the state cannot do that. The best the state can do, Anna asked that, is not kind of decolonization, but de-westernization. And I will talk more about that in relation to Anna. But I want to say third things about praxis. For us, the fundamental praxis is the praxis of living. But in kind of the modernity, praxis and theory become separated. And then you have this. You say, well, theory, but then you have the nice theory, but then what do you do in practice? But the theory is part already of the praxis, because what controls subjectivity is knowledge. And if we don't change knowledge, the way of knowing, we don't change the way of sense. And that was the failure of decolonization during the Cold War. They took control of the state, the native population, the elite, took control of the state, but they didn't question political theory and political economy. They were doing exactly the same that was handed to them by the imperial guys, but they were doing in their own benefit. So the state is no longer a way to change the world. And where do you do it? You cannot do it in the corporation. You cannot do it in journalism anymore, because journalism is controlled by the corporation. So you have to use the kind of social media is a problem, but you can use technology or kind of internet to do other kind of things. So the reorganization of ourselves, to kind of the linking from the way that the state and the corporation want us to be, and be something else in the borderland again. No? Well, that is just to say something about that. There is more. So the other world, the another world, is being built, but separated from the state and the corporation. So the Zapatistas and the Kurds are two great examples, But there is a lot of people in Argentina, in Latin America. There is a group in Peru after Quijano that is working on autonomy and autodetermination. So there is a discussion about autonomy and autodetermination, but this kind of people, indigenous and peasant, kind of organizing themselves, confronting the state. They have to concede, but at the same time, they cannot just live their life waiting for the state to kind of improve them. So they have to improve themselves. So that's a kind of decolonial praxis. And the question is, what is our? In the university and the art, in whatever kind of the sphere of intellectual sphere that all of us are working, what can we do? I cannot tell you what we can do. I mean, it's a kind of question. It's an open question, but we have to think from ourselves, whatever we are, what can we do where I am? With whom can I work and what can I do? So that is what I do with many other people, like with Catherine, for example. We write books, but the books we write come from the kind of the thing we do. Teaching, for example, for me is very important. Teaching. You cannot decolonize the university because the university, private or state, are already ingrained into the corporation. So you look at the board of trustees of the corporation are people of the industries. So you cannot change the university at this point. And you cannot change the curriculum because the curriculum is, you cannot change the curriculum of the discipline because the discipline are ingrained also in the machine of modernity and Western civilization. But you can do decolonial work within the university or within the museum, or in journalism, or whatever you are, that you may not be able to change the institution, but you can do decolonial work in the institution. And for me, that one way is teaching. Undergraduate and graduate. Undergraduates are very, very important because they are. Well, I went too long here, but I think I will use what I said to address the other question. The nation state we learned from Quijano. I mean, Quijano was saying from the first moment. Well, Ronald Reagan too. Ronald Reagan was saying, what we have to do is, the problem is the state. But for Ronald Reagan, the problem was the state. You have to eliminate the state because you have to leave the corporation open. For Quijano, the state doesn't offer anymore any kind of possibility because he began to understand that the state was kind of began the link to the corporation. And the link to the corporation and the kind of the political party system that were kind of fighting against themselves but losing interest in doing something for the population. So the state was no longer, and if I want to say more, look, when we say the state, we say the nation state. There are some monarchic states in the Gulf, for example. But we are talking mainly, I mean, and there are monarchies within the nation state, in Spain, in England, in Holland. But we are talking mainly about the nation state. And the nation state, when was the nation state created? In the late 18th century, after Westphalia. Who created the nation state? An emerging ethno-class. That was emerging ethno-class that became rich for many, many ways. One of the ways was the kind of colonialism. The kind of the colonial exploitation of the Americas and Indonesia and India. That ethno-class is what we call the bourgeoisie, the European bourgeoisie, and the American Revolution, but let's say the European bourgeoisie that created the nation state. And the idea of the nation state is to marginalize the church and the aristocracy, and that is the French Revolution, right? And that is the Glorious Revolution in England. And that is the American, would call the American Revolution in the United States. So the nation state is the state of the bourgeoisie. It's a bourgeois state, and it's patriarchal, like the monarchic state. The state is patriarchal, and the state patriarchal. We live in a patriarchal culture, and so that is a task of the colonial praxis, to work toward the communal and build what I call, I have to explain, a matristic culture. A matristic culture is not matriarchal culture. A matristic culture is a culture of care in which female and male kind of share responsibilities. We cannot pretend now that we will build a matristic state, but we can do matristic work in the political society, build matristic culture. But we have to kind of be aware that the state is patriarchal. We live in a patriarchal culture, a patriarchal civilization, and it's all over because the colonial measure of power is controlled by patriarchy, right? So in that sense, the state cannot be decolonial. I mean, Evo Morales created the Secretary of Decolonization, but the Secretary of Colonization began to kind of complain immediately that what is a Secretary of, there is no possibility here. So Fernando Wanakuni Mamani was appointed Secretary of Foreign Relations. I know about Wanakuni. With my friend, we're saying, well, Wanakuni has two possibilities here. Either he is transformed into a kind of a state officer, or he will have to resign. And he did resign. And he went back to the communities, etc., etc., because he realizes that the state you cannot decolonize. And that is why I say that what you can do with the state at this moment is de-westernization, which is not an ideal solution, but de-westernization at this moment is preventing a kind of global, unilateral, unipolar control of society. That was the neoliberal project. A lot of people still think that identify neoliberalism and capitalism, and that's true. I mean, neoliberal is capitalist, but liberalism is also capitalism. And there are liberals now against neoliberals. So in the United States, like Stiglitz, Krugman, all these kind of honest liberal have been kind of chastising neoliberalism. And there are honest liberal in Europe saying, well, you see, the problem we have now in Europe is because neoliberalism entered here. So the main project of neoliberalism is kind of homogenize the world according to the neoliberal order, which is capitalist. And that I call that re-westernization. But de-westernization is preventing that to happen. People say that China is neoliberal. No, China is not neoliberal. It's capitalist. That's no question. But China is stopping neoliberalism. It's stopping the homogenizing tendency of neoliberalism that started with Christianity. That's what Christianity wanted in the 16th, 17th century, to Christianize the world. And then came France and England, secular, and said, no, we will civilize the world, but on different principles. And then came the neoliberals and said, no, we will kind of homogenize the world under neoliberalism. So in that sense, de-westernization is antagonizing neoliberalism. And if de-westernization emerged in the West, China, and in the East, but it's not limited to the East. For example, the BRICS country, which now after Brazil, after the military coup in Brazil lost power, but the BRICS was a very kind of clear de-westernizing movement. And you have two countries from, one country from East Asia, other South Asia, other North Asia, which is Russia, other South American and South and Southern Africa. So de-westernization is all over. So what these kind of states are doing is, well, we don't want to follow the IMF and the Davos and the central bank dictates what they want us to do. So at this point, the smaller or medium states are either going one way or the other. So in Argentina, we have Macri, that Kirchner was kind of negotiating with Iran, with China, with Russia. Macri just eliminated all that and turned to the United States. Now, the best way, and I think Fernandez, the new president, is playing this game very well so far, is the borderland. And they are saying, Guzman, the Secretary of Economy, and the President, Guzman, both are saying, our decision is depend on the kind of our state, our nation, not what people tell us what to do. So they kind of setting a position to negotiate with the United States and to negotiate with China and to negotiate with Russia and to negotiate with Iran and with the European Union. So that is a kind of a state borderland position, which is very, very important now for the small and medium state, right? And the other two possibilities just go either or. No? So that is the question for me, the question of the nation state now.
1 second, if I may, for a very short moment. We usually do an hour and a half, and we have now like 10 more minutes. But if anyone else would like to ask a question, maybe you could write it in the chat, and then maybe we can do a second round of questions. But please answer the other questions first, Walter, because they're very, very interesting too.
I will be short, but I will be to I would address those questions.
Thank you.
Two things in interculturality. Interculturality depends on the enunciation. Who is talking about interculturality? Interculturality.
That was Maria Eugenia.
No. The question is no. I'm not asking who asked the question. I mean, who is talking about? Is the state, the people, who is using the concept of interculturality? Who is talking about interculturality? So look at the enunciation. Don't get lost in the meaning, the semantic of interculturality. I give you a quick example. In the Pacific coast of Colombia and Ecuador, where indigenous and Afro communities kind of live together. They kind of, they don't fight, they cooperate, they're coalition. So the indigenous people talk about intraculturality. And intraculturality is we discuss things among ourselves. The Afro say, casa adentro, in-house. We discuss our things in ourselves. We have to kind of, what we're saying, about the Aymaras also. Then, when they confront the state, the indigenous people say, well, interculturality, because, and that's, you have border thinking. You have the position articulated intraculturality, casa adentro, articulated in relation to the state, or casa afuera. But the state used interculturality in the same way that in United States it used multiculturality, multicultural. And that means what you can dance, you can use whatever, dress the way you like, eat the food you like, go to the mosque, go to the synagogue, whatever, but don't question the state. So multiculturality in the United States was a replacement of the melting pot. While all the population come to United States was European white, was a melting pot. When people of color began to flock into the United States, the pot began to smell. And they said, no, melting pot, no. Multiculturalism. Ah, qué lindo. And that was kind of translated in interculturality. There are other ways of talking about interculturality, but the question is, who is talking about interculturality? How is being used? Who is using the concept? So, so the question is very important in relation to Amautaiwasi. But intraculturality and casa dentro is precisely the energy that created Amautaiwasi and that create educational institutions that are not the state, but that respond to the need of the people. So the question here is intraculturality and casa dentro is more important than interculturality and casa afuera. Because casa dentro and casa afuera is discussing with the state, but intraculturality and casa dentro is how do we organize ourselves. And open, because Amautaiwasi was not just for indigenous people, it was an indigenous pluriversity, but for all Ecuadorian or all kind of Latin America who would like to. Borges and Bolaños, that's very important. Many years ago, I have a student, I was teaching a seminar on decoloniality, and a student said, Professor Mignolo, my dissertation is about Borges, Joyce and Cortázar, and I want to argue that they are decolonial thinkers. And I said, are you crazy? And he convinced me that he was not crazy. He kind of taught me how to think. I mean, Joyce in Ireland, Borges in Argentina, he taught me how to read Borges and Joyce decolonially. Because if you, well, I mean, you see what Joyce did with Ulysses and Finnegan Wake, kind of destroy the kind of English language and all the kind of the conceptual articulation. And when you read many Borges, like Tlon Ukbar Orbis Tertius, well, that's clear. It's a clear kind of dismantling, the linking from Western epistemology. So I won't say that, and he didn't say either that Joyce or Borges are decolonial writers. I can do a decolonial reading of their literature. And now we have an Australian student who is still working on the dissertation, Kieran Murphy, and he's working on Beckett and a South Korean writer. I don't know the South Korean writer, but it's the same kind of argument. He's reading Beckett decolonially. He took a couple of seminars with me and said, not that decolonial. So I think and this is very important. Why? Because the question is not to decide who is decolonial and who is not. It's me who read Kant decolonially. So it's as the group said, the decolonial is a perspective. Like psychoanalysis. I mean, if you follow Joyce and Freud and Lacan, you can do psychoanalytic readings of literature, and a matter of fact, there is a lot of them. So you can You can very well do a decolonial reader, decolonial reading of writers that may not be clearly decolonial and doesn't matter, but also you can do decolonial reader of writers who are decolonial, like Angie Krog and Jabulo Ndebele in South Africa. They are clearly decolonial writers that kind of write after the apartheid. So it's very important to make that kind of distinction, but yes, you can do that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This is amazing. This was like really quick. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question? If not, I would say thank you, Walter, for really for taking your time for all of us. We're like this very international group of young researchers and scholars from all over the world, which is the nice thing about the Zoom format, that we can meet here in very different spaces at the same time in one space. And also for what I think that you also showed us is how we can slow down a discussion and how we can deepen our readings and yeah, take our time for this informal get together. And I think there's so much potential in conversation, right? Because usually what we're used to is the single narrative, and now in this format we can play with all these different possibilities. So thank you so much for that. And maybe as a closing remark, I really like that you touched upon the point of putting love and care in front of our values when we question all our values instead of competition and individuality. So I think that is a very nice conclusion that we can all take out of this group. And I also wanted to say that if anyone would like me to put them in the reading list, in the mailing list, I could of course do that, and then we will share this meeting because it is being recorded and edited by the Instituto de Estudios Latinoamericanos from the Colombian University. So please just send me text, or I'll put your email in the list.
So
thank you very, very much.
Let me say
Sí, por favor.
Let me emphasize this: conversation. Conversation is to build a communal. It's just conversation, and so we can what the pandemic did open up this possibility that neither of us were kind of thinking before, but I don't think we will abandon because we can concentrate in one room in one day people from Vietnam to Alaska, etc., which is, and we can do it that bi-weekly. But it's not possible doing by traveling. But conversation, not information, not communication, not transmitting information, not communication, conversation, listening. And that is what modernity has been destroyed. Modernity destroyed the communal, destroy conversation, because that is a waste of time. So you have to communicate, you have to absorb information. Oh, there is a lot of things to do. There are people in Argentina working in theater. That is amazing how they're kind of making this kind of argument. Why to come back to theater is so important. Now that, I mean, there's a lot that there's, okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really love meeting you again. Like the first time I'm talking to you is always very, very inspiring. So thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye to everybody.
Bye. Hello. Thanks for participating, everyone.